Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Governance Watch, the Conference Board webcast series brought to you in collaboration with the law firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen & Hamilton. I'm Paul Washington, Executive Director of the ESG Center here at the Conference Board. The Conference Board is the world's leading nonprofit think tank focusing on business and society, and we've been doing it for over 100 years. And the ESG Center is devoted to helping companies navigate their evolving role in society these days by delivering insights in the areas of corporate governance, sustainability, and citizenship. Today we're going to be talking about the urgent and highly relevant topic of government enforcement trends and risks stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic, how companies can prepare for them, and how the current environment is shaping both internal and external compliance investigations. I'm really delighted to be joined by three experts for our discussion today who bring a truly global perspective to our topic. John Pawlowski is Senior Vice President, Global Ethics, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Assurant, a Fortune 500 company and a global provider of risk management solutions. Welcome, John. Good to have you here.
Glad to be here.
And we've got Matthew Solomon and Lisa Vicens, who are partners at the law firm of Cleary Gottlieb. Matt and Lisa, welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Paul.
Great. So before we begin, I've got a few housekeeping notes to cover, so please bear with us. First, you can download the background materials and slide deck of today's webcast in the download section at the bottom of your screen. Please note that you can only access these materials if you're watching this program on a computer. Second, we are offering New York State CLE credit for participating in today's live program. For CLE credit, please download the CLE verification and CLE evaluation forms posted in the download section at the bottom of your screen, complete them, and email them to our friends at Cleary Gottlieb at the email address provided on the forms. For attorneys seeking credit outside New York, please list your relevant bar information on the verification form, and we'll work with you on getting credit in another state. I'll provide the verification code later in the webcast, which you'll need to write on the verification form to get CLE credit. For those of you who would like CPE credit, please click the link in the CPE request pod in the bottom right corner of the webcast to sign up for the credit. Please note that 3 pop-up messages will occur during the program to confirm your participation, and please click OK each time you see one. Okay, that's a really fascinating part. Now, I want to encourage everyone to participate in today's discussion if you're watching us and live, and so please use the chat box, which is on the bottom left of your screen, and we'll work those questions and comments you may have into the discussion as best as possible. Finally, a couple other housekeeping notes before we get underway. There's an evaluation form for the webcast, which will show up at the end of this program. This is separate from the CLE evaluation form. Please complete that as well. It really helps us improve our programming. Also, you can share this program, which will be available on demand after the fact, about 24 to 48 hours after it's broadcast, with your colleagues. So please do that. If you want to see more of us, you can enlarge the video to full screen view by clicking on the 4 arrows in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And finally, for the best possible experience, I think we're all baby Zoomers. We know how this works. Close any other apps on your computer or other device. With all of that now out of the way, we get to turn to the substance of the presentation and discussion today. So let's start with you, Matt. Basic question, but important one. What are the basic areas of focus for government enforcement authorities these days?
Sure. I guess based on my own experience and just sort of reading about, let me focus on the SEC since that's obviously an agency of particular interest to this group, just reading about what I've seen and then some discussions with people in the building, I would sort of put that into 3 buckets, Paul. The first bucket is accounting and disclosure issues, which I think are front and center, obviously, with all the market turmoil going on right now and all the judgments that have to be made by companies. And in particular, I know the SEC is focused, and they've just indicated as SEC Speaks, which is their 2-day conference where they talk about their agenda. That happened last week, as some of you may know. Maybe some of you attended virtually. They made very clear that what they're going to be looking for is companies that, in the wake of COVID, use COVID to cloak disclosure or business judgments that maybe they shouldn't otherwise, they should have otherwise done years before, months before, what have you. They're going to be very conscious of that. So there we're talking about things like impairment. We're talking about things like debt restructuring, these highly judgmental areas where, again, they'll be looking at what companies do and say in the wake of COVID just to make sure, again, that COVID isn't being used to cloak some underlying accounting impropriety or disclosure issue. So accounting disclosure is one major issue. A second major issue I'm seeing already in my own investigations is the stewardship of MNPI and potential insider trading. Got a lot of market volatility. They've got all kinds of ways that they can look at blue sheet data, they being SEC staff, try to detect irregular trading patterns, things of that sort. And there's just more MNPI coursing through companies because there's more going on right now in the world that's impacting the bottom line. So the SEC is acutely focused on that and has issued guidance on that. Then the third bucket, I think, and it is COVID-related fraud, and obviously that's going to come up in different contexts. But the nuts and bolts companies lying about the vaccine, lying about having masks of a certain quality. The SEC has brought a bunch of actions around here, including some TROs and preliminary injunctions. You'll continue to see a steady drip of that, but I think, again, COVID is also almost going to be the impetus for potential cases, not necessarily COVID-related, but brought on by reporting in the wake of COVID. So I think that's just sort of an overview of what I'm seeing.
At the SEC, and that's really helpful. And for those of you who don't live always in this world, that's material, non-public information, MNPI, right? And yeah, it is coursing through companies and places, whether it's on your supply chain side, even on the sustainability side, sometimes in the corporate responsibility areas, where folks who might not normally have material non-public information may have it. So yeah, it's more broadly infused throughout the organization. Lisa, I know you work on enforcement issues really worldwide, and especially in Latin America, other places. What sort of trends are you seeing right now? What are the areas of focus?
So it's a lot, I think, similar to some of the trends that Matt identified, I think, on a cross-border basis. I think in particular in other countries and regions that have been really affected by the pandemic, but our issuers in the United States of U.S. securities, what you're seeing is companies trying to balance their requirements and disclosure requirements in their countries, a lot of which will have much more fulsome disclosure requirements, with the disclosure requirements that they have in the United States. And we're seeing that again with respect to a lot of judgments that are needing to be made with respect to asset valuation, impairments, revenue recognition. And I think that, in terms of a trend, you're seeing enforcement authorities also trying to cooperate with one another a lot more on these kinds of issues and really trying to scrutinize the impact of the financial crisis on investors across jurisdictions. And so I think that, it's a lot of the same trends, but unfortunately under different regulatory frameworks and with multiple authorities that companies are having to contend with.
Right. And does the collaboration among the authorities actually help companies these days, or is it making it somewhat more complicated? You'd think it should help, right, if they're trying to harmonize their approaches, but I'm just wondering what you're saying thus far.
It depends a little bit on what we're talking about. In terms of if you're actually in the context of an investigation, and if you're in the context of actually being investigated by multiple authorities, I think having coordinated investigations where at the end of the day you can hopefully achieve global peace in any resolution that you reach with authorities is actually very helpful to companies. I think when we're talking about things like, for example, what constitutes information that needs to be disclosed to the market and and the timing of those disclosures, I think differences in those types of regimes can actually be a little bit risky for companies, because you want to make sure that you're obviously complying with the different regulatory frameworks you're under. But in the United States, for example, disclosing something early on can give rise to a continuous obligation to keep the market updated as to any changes in your disclosures. And so I think it depends a little bit on what we're talking about, but I agree.
Got it. Yeah. it depends where you are. So John, from your perspective from inside a company, an important global company, you've had some exposure recently to government enforcement authorities, regulatory authorities out there. What are you seeing? What are they focusing on?
Yeah, when COVID hit, it was very much focused on business continuity, and we got questions from all 50 plus U.S. regulators and international regulators where they were asking how prepared were we for this pandemic and our ability to pivot and still operate virtually. And of course, in the U.S., that was complicated by the fact of every state defined what an essential service was differently. So we had to quickly kind of do our own assessment. But it's interesting on reflection. Business continuity in the insurance space was almost not a check the box, but it wasn't from a regulatory perspective as much of a focus, obviously, as it is now. So we anticipate that to continue to be a focus of our regulators.
Got it. So some of us have been around long enough to have gone through a lot of different crises in the last few decades, including the financial crisis of over a decade ago. So I'm wondering, Matt and Lisa, you mentioned a number of disclosure areas. Don't use it to mask underlying accounting issues, and make sure you've got control over material non-public information and so forth. Lisa, what's different this time? What's different compared to the 2008 financial crisis? Maybe what's even different from what you were saying at the outset of this year?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think first, and I think most obviously, the origin and the sources of this crisis differ in very material respects from past crises. Obviously, a pandemic is different than a financial crisis. But I think that can also, have a bearing on how the authorities are looking at companies who are impacted by the pandemic. Unlike the 2008 financial crisis or even, earlier financial crises, there's not really any clear bad guys who are responsible for the crisis in terms of sort of the financial impact. In fact, to the contrary, you have a number of industries like the aviation or retail industry that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic through no fault of their own. And I think that is going to impact the way that regulators view these issues and the lens through which they view it. That being said, I do think that there are going to be similarities in how enforcement authorities react from prior crises and the current crisis. And I think that, the reasons for that are understandable. Whether or not it's a pandemic or whether or not it's a financial crisis, there's going to be market impacts. First and foremost, in terms of a downward market, there's going to be impact on how companies perform, and that can lead to companies committing financial fraud, market manipulation, as Matt mentioned, or trying to hide, the impact on their companies through their disclosures. It can also create an opportunity, as you mentioned, Paul, to basically hide prior misconduct under the guise of COVID-19 and hope that you can get away with it. And I think that's where we're really going to see the enforcement authorities focused on. Unlike prior crises, I think they're going to be looking for the people who are taking advantage of the situation, who are trying to hide the impact on their investors and make it worse for everyone in the country by basically taking the fraud and taking the current crisis and exploiting it through fraud.
Got it. Interesting. And I guess there's before in the financial crisis in 2008, you would probably have a good sense whether you're going to be under the microscope, because if you're one of the bad guys, right? But now, I guess it's almost anyone's potentially under the microscope. Is that also maybe a difference now?
That's right. I mean, I think that, one thing Matt mentioned SEC Speaks conference last week, and one thing that, for better or worse, is that a lot of what is going to be, investigated is going to be based on reviewing in hindsight what companies have done to basically manage the crisis. And so that does unfortunately mean that even if you're not a bad guy, if you're just an industry that's been, suffering under the impact of the financial crisis, you have to think carefully about the disclosures you're making and how you're qualifying your disclosures, what risk factors you're including, what forward-looking information you're disclosing. And it also means that you need to really think about and assess the accounting judgments that you make and any differences or changes in those accounting judgments as a result of the pandemic.
Got it. So, John, I know you've been through, we've talked about this in advance of this call, you've been through a number of crises going back to the dot-com bubble and so forth. So how are you seeing this current set of enforcement activities differing from what you've experienced in the past?
Well, it's really hitting on some of the same points that were already raised by Lisa, but in 2008, I worked for a bank holding company that wasn't involved in some of the bad practices of others. So we got swept into the regulatory reform that was occurring in the banking industry and created a lot of disruption for our business because of other bad actors. And I think to Lisa's point now, in the current crisis, because there's not one bad thing, it's a virus. It's, what are others doing that could affect us? And are we going to get swept into the bad acts of others? Just by being in the industry that we operate in. So it's really looking at what's happening with others.
Got it. Interesting. So there's a contagion effect that you've got to look for now. So Matt, oftentimes government agencies will telegraph, and you mentioned the SEC speaks, though, their enforcement priorities through guidance to the marketplace. How much is that happening thus far? Are you seeing, and what should companies be taking away right now, maybe in addition to what you've already talked about, that they in changing their own conduct in light of what you're hearing from agencies telegraphing into the marketplace?
Sure. No, I think the SEC is telegraphing, and it started doing it at a pretty early stage with guidance that it put out on the management of material non-public information. The code the Enforcement Division put out that guidance, and I would commend anybody to take a look at that just to see what they're telling you they're seeing, because as night follows day, when the SEC issues that kind of guidance, they're going to bring cases. They've already got them in the pipeline, probably ready to bring at that point. That's why they're putting out that guidance. It's not really guidance, it's more sort of a warning shot. But again, back to the accounting, I think it's interesting that just last month the SEC started a new initiative, the Eps Initiative, which is a program they built in-house to cover earnings management practices, and they look at the reporting companies and look for anomalous patterns in quarterly EPS reporting. So it's kind of like the SEC likes to sort of kick you when you're down a little bit. In the teeth of COVID, they're now putting out this EPS reporting program that will cover not just prior quarters, the last couple of quarters when we've been in COVID, but also prior practices. So again, they're really looking to bring cases in the accounting space. And so in that regard, the Office of Chief Accountant also put out guidance in the last 2 or 3 months. Again, if folks have not read that, I would definitely commend you all reading it, because they tell you exactly what they're concerned about. They tell you what the issues are. And of course, it may be, if you do have a problem, and hopefully none of you do at your company, it may be too late to remedy that problem. But just having eyes on what they're looking at least enables you, as you're doing your diligence and you're testing your controls, to start thinking about the narrative, the affirmative narrative you can provide to the SEC or another regulator for that matter, who may come looking at a particular practice or something that you just told the auditors about that you may have to disclose in your next quarterly filing or the case. So I think that's the way the guidance is very helpful. And then there's guidance also about emerging market practices. So for those companies, I'm not sure exactly what the representation is on this call, but obviously for companies that operate in emerging markets, the SEC has a lot of skepticism about the information coming out, in particular of China. And they've been at war with a number of companies in China that are refusing or making it difficult for the SEC to obtain work papers from auditors in China. And I think the SEC told us with their last bit of guidance, our tolerance is really running thin. So to the extent there are subsidiaries or other business entanglements with companies operating in China, I think the SEC is sort of poised to really take a more aggressive approach to being able to bring disclosure cases against, whether it's Chinese issuers or U.S. companies that have operations in China. And again, when I left the SEC in late 2016, at the end of Mary Jo White's tenure, we were really pushing hard to get this stuff out of China. There's been a bit of a lull now because there was a settlement entered into with the big 4 accounting companies where they committed to get those work papers to the U.S. authorities. reading between the lines, it seems that's broken down. And if we do get a Biden administration and we do get Elizabeth Warren influenced chair of the SEC, you can be sure, again, that disclosure to U.S. investors from overseas companies is going to come to the fore. So I think that's something else that I would be looking out for. And the one other quick point I would make, just because I'm seeing this again and again in investigations that are popping up in my own cases, is we're getting a lot of third-party subpoenas for companies because of the business practices they may have with their vendors. So, for example, a vendor may say at the end of calendar year 2017, hey, company A, can you accelerate these payments or convert this license into something a little bit different so I can get the money in December instead of January? And just be very careful, I think, about diligencing counterparties, because there's counterparty risk, not necessarily from an accounting aiding and abetting perspective, but just be hyper aware, because if the SEC is looking for rev rec cases and things like that, it's not going to be your companies, probably, hopefully. It's going to be some of your vendors, smaller companies, even private companies. And so you want to be very careful when people are doing these negotiations. If something doesn't smell right, make sure that folks elevate it so that you can protect yourselves. Because the SEC is going to look broadly, again, not just at private companies. They're bringing cases against not just public companies, private companies also based on 10B theories.
Got it. Now that's really helpful, and that picks up on John's point earlier, too, that even if you're clean, right, your company's doing everything that's right, be very conscious that others, your suppliers, vendors, other people you may be working with are, may not be as clean, and you could get dragged in by third-party subpoenas or other ways into those investigations. Lisa, before I've got another question for Matt, but just talking about the telegraphing, Matt talked about what the SEC is doing. What are we seeing outside the U.S. in terms of agencies telegraphing their priorities right now?
That's a great question. So I think that in some of the other countries that I operate in particular in Latin America, some of these vendor issues come into play really from an ABC perspective. And you see a lot of authorities that are really investigating and looking into what kind of diligence you're doing on your third parties to the extent that you have, for example, supply chain disruptions. What are the decisions that you're making in terms of, how much you're looking into ABC risk for any, for any new services that you somehow have to handle. Mm-hmm. And similarly, I think there's been a lot, and this is similar to the United States, there's been a lot of relief funding as well as, I would say, government procurement, large projects that, have really led to just like a lot of contacts, new contacts between companies and government officials. This can happen on a large scale with, like with a huge government bid, or it can happen at a very smaller sort of contact, for example, with inspections and government officials coming in to enforce new health, safety, or environmental regulations. And all of those touch points, again, create incentives for potential corruption, and have really been, I'd say, a large focus of regulatory authorities in Latin America, which is the jurisdiction I most often operate in.
Right. No, I think that's another good, really useful area to be conscious of, which is whether you're receiving money as part of infrastructure projects or a vaccine effort, or you're getting government assistance, and that was geared toward helping companies that were suffering. That's another area for enforcement risk and for focus. So Matt, you mentioned earlier the election coming up. I'm not sure which election you're talking about. There hasn't been any attention paid to it. No, but seriously. So what, are we seeing trends right now that you think would carry forward into 2021, and how might the U.S. presidential election affect those enforcement trends? What should people be conscious of? Because we're all about insights for what's ahead. So to the extent that you can look ahead into 2021 and beyond November 3rd, what might you see developing in terms of enforcement trends?
Yeah, so look, that's a great question. I think everybody's sort of wondering about that. We're all on pins and needles. And of course, we should do this again, maybe the 2nd, 3rd, maybe 4th, or in December, or whenever the election is settled, and we'll know a lot more. Look, if Trump stays in, This has been a reasonably aggressive SEC for a Republican-led SEC. Jay Clayton's been, I think, very independent. He's very supportive of enforcement. He's empowered the enforcement directors to bring some aggressive cases, not the way Mary Jo White did, but I think it's been pretty aggressive. I think we'll see more of the same. A lot of what I just spoke about, the accounting, the MNPI, the sort of nuts and bolts dirtbag companies that put out false and misleading statements related to COVID, or pump and dumps, Ponzi schemes. That's the stable of SEC cases that will continue. I do think you're going to see much more aggressive enforcement in terms of some of the, what you used to call broken windows type cases. You're going to see negligence claims resuscitated in a way under a Biden administration that you haven't really seen under a Trump administration, where it's not just going to be core fraud that the SEC is principally focused on. It'll be stuff where you sort of pull the lens out a little bit. You're not quite sure you can assign individual culpability, but you know something bad happened, and there's ways the SEC can get their pound of flesh, even, again, where you don't have a specific fraudulent statement, misleading statement. There'll be a hyper-focus on controls, I think, having companies clean up their acts. There'll be a heavy focus on whistleblower claims. I think that pipeline has been very robust, continue to be robust. Just to pivot for just a minute, if I could, Paul, because I see there's a question. Maybe I could just shield this.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So there was a question about how do SEC guidances affect foreign issuers listed in U.S. markets. It's a great question. It's a bit of a complex question. And Carolyn, who asked the question, feel free to give me a ring at any point. We can talk this through. But for U.S. issuers, obviously, Sarbanes-Oxley applies, and you've got all the bells and whistles of the U.S. securities laws and whatever other regimes that you're subject to regulations for. Foreign private issuers, pretty similar. You're also, as those of you who work there know, you are subject to Sarbanes-Oxley. Not all the provisions of SOX, but many of them. You're 20F filers. You've got your filings with the SEC. So it's pretty easy if you're a Deutsche Bank, for example, or one of these large financial institutions, or overseas foreign private issuers. It's just as easy, unfortunately, as a U.S. issuer to get tied up with the SEC. They have most of what they can do vis-a-vis a U.S. issuer they can do concerning a foreign private issuer. Some different reporting channels, obviously. The trick comes in when you're a company that's listed elsewhere, but you've got, for example, ADRs trading in the U.S. That's like Nissan Motor Corporation. And really there you're looking at 10B core fraud for the SEC to have jurisdiction over you. You don't have specific Sarbanes-Oxley controls or books and records requirements. You're not listed on a U.S. exchange. But there's still, the SEC has been very aggressive. Nissan case is one that my firm worked on, where we resolved the case for Nissan, even though they were only level 1 ADR filers. But there's many other companies that have very attenuated links to U.S. and maybe very few U.S. investors. And even under the Trump administration, if you think that they've been less aggressive, they've been pretty aggressive about going after Volkswagen, for example. Again, Nissan, Toshiba. There's been a number of cases where the SEC is flexing its muscles. So you need to be less concerned if you're not a foreign private issuer, but still wary of fraud, or if you're doing an offering in the U.S., they may get jurisdiction. Foreign private issuers, you got to be considerably concerned, and obviously U.S. issuers are subject to the full panoply of rules and regulations. But again, happy to talk this through, Carolyn, if that didn't give you a complete answer to that.
No, that's really helpful. Thanks. And we are trying to take a global perspective on it, so thanks for fielding that. Okay, so we're looking forward to, if that's the right term, potentially more aggressive enforcement and maybe going beyond core fraud, looking at negligence. And of course, negligence or recklessness can also come up in the course of an investigation. So even if there's not an underlying issue, the way you respond in an investigation can expose you to additional liability. Okay, that's a lot to look forward to. So what do you do to prepare? So John, a couple questions for you. So what advice would you give to public company executives who are actually trying to get ahead of enforcement issues right now? What do you want to, what should companies, what are you doing, what should companies be doing to monitor these key risk areas, whether it's relating to disclosure or accounting or to taking government money or something like that? What should people be doing to stay ahead of these potential enforcement risks?
Well, adding to what was said, our focus, or my focus for my team, is really on vendor risk management, which we view as diligence around ABC, AML. We see it all as interrelated. And it's not just COVID that caused that. It's just exacerbated. We have a part of our business that's light manufacturing and relies on supply chain. So when you're looking at those relationships, you're taking a different look now post-COVID than you did before, and making sure that you've got appropriate controls around how that business is managed, that you're overseeing it and able to find things before they happen or have warning signs that allow you to dig in and investigate before there's a problem.
Got it. Thanks. And, you know, as you're looking at that, how do you stay on top of the evolving state of vendors? I'm just curious, you know, like, how do you, as a practical matter, keep on top of what's probably a rotating cast of characters in this area? And I know you guys have changed you've expanded your business a bit so that you have a new set of vendors that you're dealing with. So how do you stay on top of that, and how do you make sure that your people on the ground are staying on top of the risks that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I think most companies will think first they're going to look at their biggest relationships from a risk standpoint, but if you apply a tiered rating system, quite often you'll find that some of the smaller relationships are a greater overall risk to the enterprise than the big guys. So really it's building a strong vendor management process in the business, having compliance and legal as a part of that to help drive, you know, the structure, and then recognizing that your scoring system between tiers, if you have 4 different tiers, for example, of vendors, that your scoring system is set up so that you can identify what may be perceived as a lower risk, smaller vendor and bubble them up for evaluation and perhaps a little more inspection as you have an ongoing relationship. And that's not just up front, that's continuing throughout the life of the relationship.
Got it. No, really helpful. Sometimes the larger, more established vendors, you know, are in better shape and there's less risk associated with them. So yeah, you can get tripped up by the smaller folks. So Lisa, what advice would you give companies right now to stay ahead of some of these enforcement risks that we've been discussing?
So we've been talking a lot about, you know, different risks, and, you know, I thought that, you know, some of the risks that we've been talking about around ABC, I thought that was really great advice, you know, that really comes down to continuously assessing the risks that are facing your organization and having the tools in place to be able to do so, which means really investing in this technology that's going to allow you to centralize the information that you gather and to really monitor effectively whether or not your controls are functioning or if there are new risks that are confronting your organization. Matt spoke a little bit about, you know, some of the accounting and disclosure related risks. And there, I think, again, you know, information and communication and compliance overall is key. Companies really, now more than ever, need to take care to make sure that they're following their processes for financial reporting and have a really robust process in place for really keeping track of and memorializing the different judgments that they're making in case that they are looked at in hindsight. I just really want to, because I think there's 2 other risks that we haven't really spoken a lot about that I think, you know, when we're talking about staying ahead and keeping on top of it, it bears mentioning. And one is, you know, if you are actually a recipient of CARES Act funding, I think that, again, you know, making sure that you are keeping track of and identifying, you know, the basis for your need for, your eligibility for, and your use of CARES Act funding is going to be critical. Again, I think that we can expect that will be inspected and looked at, and that there will be robust enforcement around that. And the final risk that I think we haven't really spoken of, but I think is also one that companies can kind of mitigate in advance, is cybersecurity. Matt, there's a lot of overlap with information security and some of the MNPI issues that Matt spoke about. You know, because there is this risk, especially in a remote working environment, around keeping your information confidential and making sure that your employees understand the importance of keeping that information confidential and that you have the right technology and security around that. And, you know, cybersecurity, again, and data privacy really, really depend on having the right controls in place, having the right processes in place. So I'd say overall it's compliance, but really compliance focused on these key risk areas.
That's really, really helpful. And picking up on the notion of cyber. So that's how we're doing this. We're all remote doing this webcast. Everyone's, you know, most people are working from home these days. That presents particular challenges, right? We've got this situation where there are, extraordinary external circumstances, additional risks that companies need to deal with, potentially more aggressive government enforcement coming down the pike. And John, you're having to manage a compliance program remotely. And you're trying to train people. You're trying to you stay on top of all of these risks, virtually. We all know from firsthand experience that a lot of this, if you're trying to monitor your vendors, if you're trying to, be in touch with your employees, sometimes being in person is really important. So how are you, what have you seen the impacts thus far of being remote when it comes to compliance? Is it all challenges? Are there any benefits that come with it? And how are you adapting to your compliance program to this environment right now?
Yeah, so as a lawyer and a compliance officer, I've learned a lot just in the hall talking to people or in the office of an executive, learning about what they're doing that you can't do virtually, so you have to find other ways to get to that information, more one-on-ones that are purposeful in the fact that you're trying to drive out information, just what's top of mind, not as much agenda-driven as a discussion. And then leading a team that's global, it's having more virtual meetings. I used to do more conference calls before COVID. Now I do them visually so that I can see people, where I was used to traveling and seeing them in person. Now I'm connecting, over Zoom. So it's changed the way I lead as a compliance officer. And then I'd add, from a vendor risk management standpoint, we had to look at our vendors that had data specifically to say what were their abilities to send their employees home and what were their data protection controls. And we ended up cutting off some vendors that couldn't adequately assure us that their employees working from home would have the same level of control that they would have working in the office. So it required us not only to look at our own internal controls around data security, but all of our vendors in a very, microscope-driven focus.
No, that's a great piece of advice for anyone who hasn't done that yet, especially because we expect remote working is going to continue globally for some time. So if you haven't done it yet, that's useful to look at. Lisa, Matt, any other thoughts on how companies can be managing their compliance program, maybe particularly with respect to whistleblowing during this remote period?
Yeah, I mean, this is an area, again, I mentioned before, that's fraught and can potentially bite you even if you are an overseas company. There's some, it's not crystal clear for foreign private issuers and other companies that operate in the U.S. markets but are not FPIs how the whistleblower laws intersect, but you don't want to be the company to test that proposition because there are whistleblowers being paid out now overseas much more frequently than before. The SEC clearly wants to extend that program as much as possible. So I don't know. I guess the couple things I'd say about whistleblower programs generally is the SEC keeps emphasizing tone at the top. They use those words again during SEC Speaks. It's a platitude. I get it. Like, that's not really helpful. But you look at the tone at the top at a couple other companies that have been wrapped around the axle over the last few years, and it's something that incenses the SEC, whether it's Elon Musk or they want to see the figurehead of the company, the leaders of the company, on things like compliance, on things like running down whistleblower claims as appropriate, not boiling the ocean, but taking them seriously, making sure the audit committee has visibility. That narrative is going to be absolutely crucial if your company has an issue to be able to point to statements, point to directives, point to policies. So again, it's a great time and it doesn't cost a whole lot. You don't even need to hire outside counsel for it, but take another look at your whistleblower policies and procedures. Take another look at obviously your controls is a bigger issue because, again, if we get an administration change, folks remember all those cases that were brought by Mary Jo about retaliation of whistleblowers and about companies not having written into employment agreements and termination agreements statements that they've leaked shield whistleblowing. We're going to see a resuscitation of all the stuff that we saw before. They're going to be looking to make examples out of companies, and maybe we've gotten a little bit lax. Again, this group, I doubt it, but I think staying vigilant, putting our mindset back to a few years ago and just preparing, again, what do we say if we're asked about this pretty serious allegation against somebody in management and all we can show for it, that's got some there potentially, there's a lot of smoke, and we're giving it to an investigator who does an interview and then closes it down. That's just, we're going to be very, very careful about those kinds of judgments, because it's not going to bite you now. It's going to bite you 2 years from now when the SEC does its backward-looking, more aggressive approach. And also, just finally on the whistleblower, the SEC has paid out something like $200 million this year. And I know this group gets it, but I always like to say, as a former chief litigation counsel for the SEC, we never sponsored the testimony of a whistleblower in court, thank God, because if you have to do that, that whistleblower can be cross-examined on the fact that that person only gets paid if the SEC wins. So I think you need to balance, and now I'm cutting the other direction, in figuring out which whistleblower investigators really dedicate a lot of time on. You do have to consider the source. You don't want to try to identify that person, but if that person is identified, you can use logic and reason to think about, is this really a dangerous situation, or is this somebody who, at the end of the day, if they make the report to the SEC, we feel confident we've done enough to be able to defend what we've done, and we're moving on. It's a balance, and we've got a compliance professional, obviously, who knows this well, that's going to be revisited again and again. But if you're an executive and you're not thinking about these issues or don't have enough bandwidth to handle them, please just make sure that somebody in your organization is focused on them, because I do think there's going to be a resurgence of whistleblower-related complaints, and then around the edges, perhaps some SEC enforcement actions to make companies clear of what they can and can't do vis-a-vis whistleblowers.
Okay.
Yeah, I would add, if I might, around tone
at
at the
please.
top, the DOJ guidelines are talking more and more about the updates, tone in the middle. How do you get it throughout the organization so that all managers are talking about speaking up and the importance of ethics and integrity in your corporate culture? So I wouldn't just leave it to the top. I'd attack it from all fronts.
Yeah, let me ask you about that. People often talk these days about how compliance is a lot more effective if it's not just a sort of legal, you must do this, but if it's coupled to the company's values, that it really is ethics and compliance. But even beyond, ethics is a tricky word for a lot of people. Like, what does it mean? Is it morality or whatever? But if you couple it to the company's values, John, how are you guys sort of maybe broadening the notion of compliance at Assurance to make sure that it's something that people who aren't lawyers kind of take to heart? Just curious.
Yeah, it's communicating your values in a way that the concepts of ethics and integrity and doing the right thing are very apparent in the communications you deploy throughout the year and the tools you give to managers so that they can talk to their teams about it. And I would add, just currently, the connections with D&I, that an ethics office has, that must have, in order to address social justice issues that are so prevalent in our society. So it's really, I think, through all of this, demonstrating how intermeshed compliance and ethics is across culture and business operations.
Right. So that's key in setting that tone in the middle and getting buy-in on that. Okay, so that's really helpful. Yes, please, Lisa, go on. Yeah.
I would just add, I think that, I agree with everything that John said, and I think it really is about creating a culture of compliance. What I think is interesting for the panel that we're having today is it's almost existential in a way. How do you maintain that culture in the completely remote working environment where your culture, where your corporate culture is really in itself, sort of diversified all over the world with people working from home? And so, I think that a lot of the stuff that John spoke about, which is, really making sure that you're connecting to people, both in the communications that you're having, in one-on-one meetings through all sorts of different venues, continuing your training program, which was something I think, Paul, that you alluded to, and just, again, reinforcing that these are shared values. Those are all really important ways, even in the current context, for companies to continue not only to, I think, reinforce their culture, but to really give their employees a sense of identity and a sense of security in what can feel like a very isolating situation.
No, that's a really good point, that actually the compliance department actually plays this maybe more fundamental role in keeping people connected to their company. It's not just this obligatory thing that's imposed, but it can actually be core to the company's culture, core to the company's cohesiveness during this time. So I think that's a really useful insight. Thank you, Lisa and John, for that. So Matt, one question before we sort of shift gears and get a little bit into how you conduct an investigation during this time. So a lot of companies now are preparing for their year-end financial reporting. Are there additional steps the company should be taking right now in light of all of the risks stemming from COVID-19 during this process?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying hard to stay away from platitudes because you guys can get those. I mean, look, I talked to the former SEC's chief accountant a few minutes before this call, and I just said to him, what should these folks know? And he said, gave me three things. He said, asset impairments. The SEC and auditors will look at goodwill and intangibles vigilantly. So that's something to be hyper-focused on. It's sort of what this guy's seeing in the marketplace. Controls, and not just, I know everybody says, oh yeah, make sure your controls are functional, but he was saying in particular you want to be careful about, for example, signing certifications when you don't have face-to-face access with a lot of folks who you count on to give you this real-time information. So you want to think about controls in terms of remote work. Think very carefully about that because the SEC will. And they say they're not going to second-guess reasonable business judgments on the one hand, but on the other hand, the controls have to be reasonably tailored to your business. That includes the environment that we're in right now. So this individual was saying be very vigilant about how controls can be thwarted, impacted, or might even need to be tinkered with or at least rethought in light of COVID. That's something the SEC is going to be thinking about. And then item 303 of MD&A, trends and uncertainties, again, because of the downturn, I think there's going to be a lot of focus from Corp Fin and also from enforcement. They'll be looking very carefully and critically at item 303. So those are specific things to think about, and then just generally be timely with as much as you can. Document what you're doing. Now it's going to be more important than ever because if they're going to second guess, you at least want to have a contemporaneous record of what you're doing and why you're doing it now. And then again, I think engagement with auditors is obviously always at a premium, but to be very open and transparent with auditors, to discuss with them the potential things that you're looking at doing, be very receptive to the auditors' guidance on that. The thing you want to avoid in this environment or any environment is doing obviously a restatement, because once you do that, the SEC is going to open an inquiry or an investigation. So if there's steps you can take to avoid that by early engagement, documentation, again, very careful business judgments, easier said than done, but those are the few pieces of advice I would say, at least going into this earnings season, where I think come December, January, February, March, there's going to be a lot of decisions companies are making. They're going to be very carefully looked at by the SEC through the lens of hindsight.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for making that call before for this webcast. That was really helpful because it's literally hot off the presses, although that's sort of a dated term. So, but thanks. Let me pause for a second and give everyone the CLE code announcement. The CLE verification code that you need to put on the form is 12275. Again, it's 12275. So now we talked about working in a remote environment, compliance in general in a remote environment. I'd like to talk a little bit about conducting investigations in this environment. So, Matt, others, how are government agencies actually conducting their investigations during this period when people are working from home? How is that actually unfolding? How has this environment affected government investigations? Yeah.
Very briefly, from the SEC standpoint, very haphazardly. And it is absolutely critical if you have an SEC investigation or inquiry, and I think the same is true of DOJ. I just happen to be doing more SEC work right now. They're developing their rules and practices, and they're pushing some people around, and other people they're allowing to maybe push them around a little bit. And if you're being investigated, you want to find that happy medium. And just one concrete example, I represent an individual, CEO of a fintech company, who the SEC actually insisted come in for testimony. Remote testimony, I didn't want to do it because I wanted to be able to sit with him in the same room, which we ended up doing anyway. But I pushed them off. They were very aggressive about needing to make charging decisions. And ultimately, we were able to get a concession that we got all the documents ahead of time that they were going to show him during his testimony. That was a huge win. And they don't usually do that. And they don't do it for everybody, but there are ways, I think, to make the government's difficulties with their investigations work for you, the person being investigated, and that's just one concrete example. But I think it's been a struggle, Lisa. I don't know if you've got experience recently with overseas investigations, or John, whether you're in the midst of any of these, but I think it's very haphazard. You just want to have a strategy going in as the person being investigated, or even a third-party person being investigated, so that you can, make it work for you, make the government's difficulties work for you. We want to do the right thing, but we also don't want to be, spending a ton of money or helping them any more than they need to be helping themselves with these kinds of.
Yeah, Lisa, maybe internationally, how are folks outside the U.S. managing investigations during this time?
I think that there's been a little bit of an evolution. I think at the outset of the pandemic, I think when all of us were sort of in the mindset that this was going to be a short-term or temporary situation, there was a slowdown in investigations. I'd say in the U.S., but definitely from authorities abroad, I think that you saw that. I think that largely has ceased to be the case. I think that, enforcement authorities, both in the United States but also abroad, have picked up on their investigations and are learning to adapt to the pandemic. And as Matt said, learning how to collect and how to collect information and conduct interviews, even remotely. It can still lead to some delays. I recently was involved in an investigation with the Department of Justice where a witness who was overseas and who otherwise would have come to the United States, traveled to the United States to make themselves available to be interviewed, obviously wasn't going to do that in the context of a pandemic. And so, the authorities took the position that they needed an MLAT, because basically an assistance treaty with the authorities in the other jurisdiction, because this witness was going to be sitting in another jurisdiction, even though the interview was going to be conducted fully remotely over Zoom. And so that sort of added to the timing and the complexity of how those interviews would be conducted. So there definitely is an impact. I do think, though, consistent with the U.S., that these investigations are ongoing and that they're starting to pick up.
And John, I'll ask you in a minute about internal investigations that you're conducting. I don't know if you've got any experience with external investigations you feel comfortable sharing. If not, I'll get to internal investigations.
Yeah, I'd give an internal viewpoint, and that is that, with managing a helpline, you're interviewing people quite regularly, and when you can do it internally or in an office setting, you can read body language, you've got more control over the environment. When you're doing it virtually, you don't know what's behind the camera. You don't know what materials the individual is prompting themselves with, if they are. So we spend a lot more time strategizing around the interview process and how we reveal evidence during the interview to see how they react to it, and also building a stronger rapport virtually so that you can get them to open up, because being interviewed by a corporate investigator is a stressful situation for any employee. So you have to figure out a way to make them more comfortable in a virtual setting that can't come across as it can in person. So we've really had to rethink our interview process to still get what we need as part of the investigation.
Yeah, and which is really interesting. So it's building that rapport. It's taking a different approach in the interviews. What about going after documents? I mean, that I also wonder. It's not like they've got their work computer that how do you even make sure that you're getting a full picture of the documents that your employees may have, whether you're conducting your own internal investigation or even responding to an external investigation? That would seem to be trickier these days than in the past. It's not the same as just handing in your computer, your phone, and so forth. So how do you do that?
Yeah, it is a challenge. I mean, I would say that working virtually, we're less paper reliant than we were in the past. Mm-hmm. Not everybody has a printer at home. Mm-hmm. So there's less paper being printed, less paper materials you have to seek, but it's really having good internal controls around your computer systems so that you've got data saved on servers, not on the laptop. You lock down your laptops. You have good policies around the use of phones if they're, BYOB, and where information is retained so that you have access to it. It's a challenge because you can't go into the office and inspect it. Yeah. The way you could, in an office.
Yeah, and that these controls you're putting in place now they'll need to persist, right? Because people will be working remotely for a long time. So this isn't a temporary circumstance that people have to be dealing with here. Yeah,
that's right.
Really interesting. Love to spend more time on it. We're coming toward the end. So let me do a lightning round with each of you. So what's the number one piece of advice you have for companies right now to get ready for the upcoming wave of government enforcement, whether it's local, national in the U.S., or international? Lisa, starting with you, and then Matt, and then John. Number one piece of advice.
So, I mean, I say this understanding that we are in the middle of a financial crisis and a pandemic, and so this might seem counter-intellectual, but my number one piece of advice would be to invest in compliance, having strong controls and processes, the ability to really monitor the risks that are facing your organization, and the tools to be able to confront those risks are critical to companies being in a good position to be able to forestall any of these enforcement actions and to be able to respond if they do occur. And so invest in compliance.
Matt, so that's a message to boards and CEOs out there from your chief compliance officers and their outside counsel, but it makes sense. Matt.
And just building on that for a second, and you can do it looking at your own doc preservation policies, your own insider trading policies, how you're dealing with material non-public information where people have stuff at their home. You know, just make sure you've covered the waterfront so that you've got your house in order so that if somebody does come looking, you've got a good counter narrative. I guess I would just say my one piece of advice is if you have a problem or you think you're going to have a problem, make sure that you get somebody to help you who's a creative thinker and who you know, thinks a little bit outside the box. There's no one-size-fits-all to how to deal with an enforcement problem, and sometimes it might make sense, for example, in the whistleblower situation, you may want to go to the SEC before the whistleblower does. You may want to go to the SEC and say, you've got a complaint we know has been filed, pull it out, we want to talk to you about it. There's just a lot of ways to skin a cat, and in 4 years of practice, and I was in the government for 17 before that, I realized there's just a lot of different ways to go at these compliance issues, at these enforcement issues. So if you have such an issue, again, I would just think carefully. It doesn't have to be Cleary Gottlieb, but think carefully that you've got a lawyer or a set of lawyers that are not just sort of check in the box exercise on how to deal with an agency, particularly like the SEC, because personality, the people investigating you, the kinds of relief they can get at the end of the day, the kinds of statutes and the mental state required to prove them, the resource allocation, those things are incredibly important. So are relationships. So, you know, pick the right people for the right area that you have a concern with. Even if we're your usual counsel, we may not be the right counsel for the particular issue facing you. I just think those kinds of decisions as we get into a more ramped up and aggressive enforcement environment are going to be very, very important. So I guess that's my one piece of advice.
No, that's...
And that never happens, by the way. So hopefully that's something you don't have to deal with. But
yeah, no, really helpful. John, over to you.
Yeah, I would say that for companies, it's as you go through your risk and control self-assessment process, which a lot of companies do towards the end of the year, really work closely with your risk and compliance folks to understand as you identify your top risks, what are the state of controls in those risk areas or the areas that support those risks, so that you can get ahead of problems. You can apply resources based on where you assess the risk. So I'd say more engagement in that process.
That's also really helpful. Thank you. 3 great pieces of advice. Again, CLE credit, folks, it's 12275. This has been a terrific discussion about the different types of risk, the different sources of risk, how you can manage these risks in this remote environment, responding to government investigations, anticipating them, getting ahead of them. So thank you all very much for a terrific discussion. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And take care, be well, and stay safe.